Hi, this is Rob from Cumulus Cycles. In this bonus video in the CSS tutorial series, I'll walk you through adding CSS to the HTML only website I created in the video at the end of the HTML tutorial playlist. Before we get started, I want to make one edit to the login page from the HTML tutorial, and that's to change this text from already have an account, log in now, to don't have an account, register now. So I'll jump into the code and replace that text. That makes more sense for the login page. Now, let's start adding some CSS to turn the site from this to this. So I'll start out by creating a folder named CSS to hold our style sheets. And then inside of the CSS folder, I'll create a new file called styles.css. Then I'll add an HTML link with a rel style sheet and point to the style CSS file in the CSS folder inside of the index.html page. Now we can start adding some styles. First, let's go to the browser and do a comparison between our existing page on the left and the page we're trying to build on the right. Looking at the page on the right, it looks like it has some padding, some margin, and maybe a width set to a percentage of the overall page width, whereas the page on the left starts its alignment in the upper left hand corner of the browser. So let's use developers tools to inspect this page. Then we'll highlight the content area and look at the CSS, and we see that the CSS applied to the body sets the width of the content to 75% of the overall browser width. It has a padding of 10 pixels and a margin of auto to center the content on the page. So let's add these styles to our CSS file. We'll save the styles and go back to the browser. And now our page on the left has a similar formatting to the page on the right. Next, let's turn our attention to the nav. Expand the body and then the nav. Let's click on the anchor tag and check the styles. We see that all the anchor elements on the page have a text decoration set to none. However, when I hover over the anchor tag, I have a text decoration of underline. So let's apply these styles to our CSS. So this CSS says find the HTML anchor elements and default the text decoration to none. However, when I hover over the elements, change the text decoration to an underline. So let's save this, go back to the browser, and now we see our anchor tags for a link to the home page, the login and register page, and the get started all have a similar style. Now, let's focus on the nav element itself. If we click it, we can see it has a style of display set to block. And if we focus on the list items in the unordered list, we'll see they have a class set to BTN. And looking at the classes in the developer tools, we'll see several styles applied to the BTN class, as well as styles applied to the list items. So let's add these styles to our CSS and take a look at them. So in the CSS, I've targeted the list items inside of the unordered list inside of the nav element. I've floated them to the right, and I've set the list style type to none to remove the bullets from the list. I changed the display to inline, so instead of having a vertical list of items, they'll now be listed horizontally as if across a row. I've gave them some padding and some margin as well. To the list items, which will have a class of BTN, I've set their color to blue. I've also set the background color, given them a border, some padding, and a border radius to have curved corners on the buttons. I also added styles for hovering over the elements with a class of button, as well as the anchor tags inside of the elements that have a class of button. These anchor tags are the anchors for the menu items in the nav, which are inside of the list items. And in order for these styles to be applied, I need to give the list items a class of BTN. We'll save the index page, save the styles, and go back to the browser. And now we see our login and register links, which are list items inside of the unordered list contained within the nav, now look like actual buttons. Moving down the page on the right, let's take a look at the header. Inside of the header element, I have an image with an ID of logo. Then there's an H1 element which has a span with an ID of logo text. If I inspect the image, we see that the element with the ID of logo has 10 pixels of padding right, and the span has a color and a relative position of -25 pixels on the top. So let's add these styles and see how they affect our page. So here's the style that's applied to the HTML element with the ID of logo, and these are the styles applied to the HTML element with the ID of logo text. So in order for these styles to be applied to our page, we need to add the ID to the HTML elements in the header. So we'll give the image an ID of logo and surround the My Contacts text with a span with an ID of logo text. Save the page, save the styles, and go back to the browser. And now we see the image and the text in our heading on the page on the left looks like the image and the heading and the page on the right. So it looks like we're pretty close to having the home page done. We still need to style the Get Started link to look like the page on the right, which shows that the anchor tag has a class of BTN. So we'll add that in the code. And we also need to apply a style to the footer to align its text to the right. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll add the BTN class to the Get Started link, then some CSS to align the footer to the right. Save our files and go back to the browser, and now the pages look the same. Well, they actually almost look the same. The difference I see here is between the buttons on the left and the buttons on the right. Because I added a style that floated these list items to the right, I need to change the order that they appear in the HTML. So let's go back to the code, up to the nav, and change the order of the list items. And go back to the browser. Now we're looking pretty good. The reason for the difference in color between the page on the left and the page on the right is because I've already clicked these links, which show the links as being visited. If I clear the cache, now the buttons look the same. With the home page complete, let's focus our attention on the registration page. So it looks like we have a bit of work to do here, but let's start by going into the register HTML file and including our style sheet. I'll save the page and go back to the browser. Now we see we have some of the styles applied. But we need to address the login link in the nav, change the style of the register text, and add some styles to the register and clear buttons. So if we go back to the code and do a comparison between our index.html file and our register.html file, if we look at the nav and the list items inside of the unordered list in the navigation, we'll recall that we added a class of BTN to the list items. So let's add this class of BTN to the list item in the register page. And then in the header, we also added a span with an ID of logo text to the My Contacts text. So let's go ahead and add that span around the register text on the registration page. And we also gave the image an ID of logo. So let's save this code and go back to the browser. And now our page is looking closer to the page on the right. But the buttons still don't have blue text. Let's address that now. So if we come over to the sample page and inspect the button, we'll see that the button element has the same color applied as the button class. So let's go back to our CSS file and add the button selector. We'll find the selector for the button class and add the button selector. Go back to the page, and now our buttons look the same. Now, I believe the only difference between the page on the left and the page on the right is the labels for the input elements. So if we inspect this, we'll see that the label has a font weight of bold. So let's apply this to our styles. Save the CSS, and go back to the browser, and now the pages look the same. So from here, let's move on to the login page, and start by including the CSS file in the login.html. So I'll add the link for the CSS, and while I'm in here, I'll also add the class of BTN to the list item in the nav. I'll add the ID of logo to the image, and I'll wrap the login text in the span with the ID of logo text. I'll save the page and go back to the browser, and now our login page is done. So that brings us to the final page, which is the contacts. I'll start by including the CSS file, and I'll add the class of BTN to the list item, save the page, and check the browser. And now our header looks okay, and the difference between the two pages is that the page on the right doesn't have the logo. So we'll just jump back into the code, delete the image, save the page, go back to the browser, and now the pages look the same. So that concludes this demo on adding CSS to our prior HTML-only website. I hope you enjoyed following along. You can find a demo on adding Bootstrap to this site in the Bootstrap tutorial playlist.